Welcome to the Apologetics Guy Show, the podcast that helps you find clear answers to tough questions about God, Jesus, and the Bible. Now, if we're just meeting, I'm Dr. Mikel Del Rosario, the Apologetics Guy who loves all things Jesus. You know, that's been the focus of my academic work, and speaking of which, I'm an associate professor of Bible and theology at Moody Bible Institute, and I love what I do, but this show is entirely independent of the school, just to be clear. Now, one of the top questions when it comes to Jesus is, did Jesus actually rise from the dead? Some people wonder if the disciples just made the whole story up, or if the resurrection story was just kind of a myth or legend that emerged over decades and decades of cultural reflection amongst Jews who needed a Messiah figure. Well, that is what we're talking about today on the Apologetics Guy Show. It's going to be a different kind of podcast from what most apologists tend to talk about, because we are going to ask the question, where would the idea of a resurrected Messiah even come from? Where would the idea even come from? And that is going to take us into some pretty interesting territory that covers cultural and historical things that few people even know about. So what you're about to hear is a conversation I featured on my YouTube channel with my friend, Dr. Justin Bass, and I hope you enjoy the show. And my guest on the show today is Dr. Justin Bass. Justin is a New Testament professor at Dallas Christian College, and he is a fellow PhD graduate here at Dallas Theological Seminary, also a New Testament PhD grad. And he is the author of this book called The Bedrock of Christianity. The Bedrock of Christianity. And so I want to welcome you, Justin, to the show. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, brother. Great to be on with you.
Well, I want to just jump right into our topic today. It's an exciting one. Here on this show, we try to help people answer tough questions that people ask about the Christian faith and respond to these doubts that some people have, even people who are Christians who hear things in the public square that challenge the resurrection of Jesus, among other Christian truth claims. But it is a bedrock fact that on the night of Jesus' crucifixion, he was betrayed by Judas, and his followers fled and they left him. What would be the mindset, you think, of disciples of Jesus on this night after their leader had been captured and then killed, executed on a cross by Rome? What would be going through their minds?
Crushed. Absolutely crushed. I've tried to really think about that. It's a great thing to do when you're, studying not just the books of the Bible, but anything of history. Try to put yourself back into their mindset as best as you can, and just trying to imagine what it was like that Good Friday evening, that Saturday morning. I doubt they slept much that Friday night. And then even Saturday night, where were they hiding? Were they all together? It seems like maybe some of them were separate. The women were clearly separate, going to the tomb and things. But I think that story in Luke 24, where Cleopas and his buddy are, walking on the road to Emmaus, and Jesus comes up with them and has that conversation. I think in what they say, we get an idea of their mindset. I think it really captures what they were thinking, because it's really humorous, because Jesus is asking them, what's been going on? And they're like, have you been living under a rock? You don't know what's been happening in Jerusalem? And Jesus says, what things? I love that. In Greek, it's just one word, poia. What things? What things? And he goes on to explain, well, this man, Jesus, he did all these mighty deeds. Ultimately, we thought he was the Messiah, but he was crucified, and he says, we had hoped he was the Messiah. He would redeem Israel, but clearly he wasn't, because he was crucified. And so I think that captures, especially Peter, John, all the key disciples of Jesus. They must have been absolutely convinced that he was no longer the Messiah anymore, no matter how much they loved him. And they were amazed by him and in awe of him. They were convinced now by this crucifixion, by his death, by his burial, that he's not the Messiah. And so they were as depressed as you could be. This was the in some people's minds, this may be the saddest moment in history in their hearts for what they were experiencing.
A crucified Messiah is almost a contradiction in terms, right? You don't overthrow Rome, you're executed by Rome, hence probably not the Messiah. It was obviously a death blow to the movement in many senses of the word. Yes. And yet it is also a bedrock historical fact, not only that Jesus was crucified, but that his disciples had real experiences that they believed, at least, were experiences of the risen Jesus. And it wasn't just that the tomb was found empty, it was that people actually believed they saw him after he was publicly publicly executed and crucified. And so the question that most apologists jump to at this point is what caused that belief? And then we say that the resurrection best fits the known historical facts. But again, going back to the conversation that I had with this woman and other people I've talked to, the idea that maybe the disciples just made it all up, or that it just emerged after decades and decades from cultural ideas that Jewish people had. I want to explore this a little bit more to help people think through those concerns. So let's back up and even think about, where did this category even come from? Were there any traditions of a Messiah being raised to life, or an expectation of that?
Yeah, the simple answer is no. I mean, as I had a conversation with Dr. Dale Allison recently on Justin Brierley's Unbelievable, and he reaffirmed this. And he has about 30 years on us of reading, and he's one of those people that has read everything, and he's made clear, no. I mean, and all my research and everything that we've found, there is no evidence of an expectation of a resurrected Messiah, that a Messiah would rise again from the dead, like prophesied in the Old Testament, especially places like Daniel 12, that there would be this general resurrection of the wicked and the righteous. Jews expected that at the end of the world, but they did not expect a Messiah to do that in the middle of history, and then history continue on, and then there be that general resurrection at the end. And the way Paul puts it, that he's the first fruits, and then when Jesus returns, we will all, be raised with him in this harvest imagery. No expectation for that. So where did they get that idea? Where did that idea come from? Even if they had, let's say they had, the only other option you really have on the table is maybe some sort of hallucination. They believed that, something in their mind made them think Jesus came to life again and appeared to them like an apparition or something. But that still wouldn't have led them to say that he rose from the dead. That would not have led them to say resurrection language. It would have led them to say maybe that, Jesus is the great martyr. He's been exalted to heaven. He's in the heaven. He's still alive in heaven with God, like Jesus said. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were, or even the Maccabean martyrs. The way they're presented as being, exalted to heaven, and they're still alive, and they're awaiting the resurrection, but not that he is raised from the dead. I think this category is unexpected, completely innovative, and demands a historical explanation.
Yeah, thinking about the cultural milieu that all this happened in, most Greeks and Romans didn't believe in a resurrection. We know some Jews, like the Sadducees, didn't believe in a resurrection. But for the Jews who did hope for a resurrection, are there any Jewish texts that you can think of, whether they're in the Old Testament or outside, that help us understand the kind of resurrection that they were expecting, like a bodily resurrection, or was it just like a more like visionary spiritual one? Or how do we know what they expected?
Yeah, I think the evidence is very strong that the Jewish idea of resurrection, anastasis, this Greek word that's used by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 and used elsewhere in Jewish literature at that time, it's bodily. And we're talking about bodies. We're talking about physical bodies, physical matter. But very clear passages, I think, would be like what I referenced earlier in Daniel chapter 12, that it says, many who sleep in the dust of the earth will rise, some to everlasting shame and contempt, and some will shine like the stars in the heavens. And so that's very clearly, of the dust, they will rise. This is a physical resurrection. You also have in between the Old Testament books and the New Testament books, you have books of the Maccabees, which testifies to, these tortures that the Maccabean martyrs went through. And also the 7 sons that went through this torture of this mother. And one of them, puts forward his 2 arms and he says, cut off my arms and I'll get them back at the resurrection. But clearly the idea that I'm going to get them back one day in a physical way. I'm going to get my body is coming back to the earth. I'm going to rise again. And I think this is definitely the view of Paul. We see it throughout his letters that just like Jesus was raised, we also will be raised. Philippians 3 and Romans 8, make clear that this is something that's going to happen to our bodies. There's a redemption of the soma. There's the redemption of the body. So I think all the evidence is very, very overwhelming. And N.T. writes, as Resurrection of the Son of God. I mean, his first 200 pages is basically demonstrating this, and I think it's overwhelmingly strong that when they say resurrection, when the Jews said resurrection, that's what they meant. They meant bodily resurrection.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back to the concept of a Messiah. We're trying to put these two things together, the idea of resurrection that was hoped for, the idea of Messiah, but nobody ever put those two things together.
Mm-hmm.
What did most Jews hope the Messiah would actually do?
Well, kind of like you referenced before about the different, views on resurrection. It depended on the Jew for the Messiah. We only have such a small amount that has come down to us, but from that world. So we can't know everything, but from what we do know, that they had these different views of the Messiah. Some were just not even interested in a Messiah. It seems like the more Hellenistic Jews, the Jews that are scattered around, far away from their homeland, far away from Jerusalem, from Judea, people like Philo of Alexandria. I think in all of his writings, and we have a lot, he possibly mentions a Messiah type figure twice. It's clearly not an emphasis for him. He's wedding Greek philosophy with the Torah, with the law of Moses. It seems like Jews scattered out in the diaspora are not as much interested in the Messiah. It seems like the same for the Sadducees. They're far more political, far more associated with what's going on earth at the temple in Jerusalem. It doesn't seem like they're much looking for the Messiah. But we know the Essenes, because of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we know they were looking for two messiahs, a Davidic type messiah, a warrior type messiah, and then a priestly, more Aaronic type messiah. And so, and in fact, it's amazing when they do the calendar dating of the Essenes to our calendar, when they put them together, they were actually expecting these messiahs somewhere around, I saw one dated to 3 BC. So it's kind of amazing. They were expecting the Messiah to come at the exact same time when we believe the Messiah did come, which was Jesus. And I think it's because they were reading the right text. They were reading Daniel, and Daniel 9, lays out the 70 weeks. And so they were probably interpreting that. And they were, I think, they got pretty close. But the Pharisees probably capture, I think, the majority, at least, of Jews who were in Jerusalem, in Judea, the everyday, passionate Jew who believed the Torah, who believed the prophets. People like Jesus's followers, probably his 12 thought this way. Paul definitely thought this way. We know Josephus thought this way, and it was the expectation of a warrior type Davidic like Messiah who would free them from the Romans. I always, in the past, I'm outdated now, but in the past I used to say a Schwarzenegger like Messiah, but now I say a John Wick like Messiah. So they were looking for the John Wick Messiah.
Yeah.
And a great text that people can look up is from the Psalms of Solomon. It's a writing written by a Pharisee, probably about 100 BC, about 100 years before Jesus. And it lays out this conquering warrior, John Wick type Messiah that's going to just destroy all the Gentiles. And that's I think what most of them were expecting, like James and John, when they come to Jesus and they say, Jesus, let us sit at your right and your left when you come in your kingdom. I mean, I think they're thinking physical kingdom. You go to Jerusalem and you wipe them off the face of the earth, and it's now the Messianic kingdom. We want to reign sitting at your right and your left. That's why Jesus says, you don't know what you're talking about. But yeah, that's what I think. Physical kingdom, physical Messiah, Davidic type warrior. That's what they were looking for. Release them from the Romans. I think that was a very prominent view.
And then, of course, the charge against Jesus was translated over to Rome as a sedition charge, and they put the sign above the cross, above his head, that said "King of the Jews." Talk about that a little bit. Do you call that a bedrock fact in your research? Is that something that you think is a bedrock fact?
Yeah, and just to clarify, when I say bedrock fact throughout the book, what I mean is this high bar of, which is fascinating that we even have facts like this. Well beyond Jesus's existence and his crucifixion, we have a lot of facts that reach this high bar, which I call bedrock, which is basically across the board. Scholars for the last 250 years of biblical criticism today and over the last 250 years, I would say even like 98, 99 percentile, they would agree on these certain facts. So that's what it takes to reach that high bar of a bedrock fact. And yeah, I would call this a bedrock fact of the Gospels. I mean, from my studies, my research, I find that this is something that's agreed upon by everyone. Atheist, Jewish, liberal, conservative. Everyone agrees that Jesus had this sign nailed to the cross with him that was basically the sign of his crime. his crime, that he claimed to be king of the Jews. Now, what it exactly said, of course, that's debated because the Gospels give us different. Some have it longer. This is Jesus of Nazareth, the king of the Jews, and some say just the king of the Jews. But everyone agrees that it said the king of the Jews. I think Raymond Brown, the great New Testament scholar of the 20th century, he says in his big 2-volume, The Death of the Messiah, he says it's historically unimpeachable. This is one of those things and it's extraordinary because it's the one thing that was written about Jesus during his life that we know. We don't have it, but we know it was written. It's as far as if you trust, the scholars and historians, we know that was written. And what it shows is that Jesus was seen by Rome as one of these Messianic type pretenders that they were used to. There was like I said, there was at least 14 of them, others that were like Jesus. Big difference, of course, is Jesus didn't actually fight against Rome. But he was treated the same way and as a threat, and that's why they crucified him.
So a lot of times people will ask, was there anything written about Jesus during his lifetime? And they kind of make a big point about that, and of course we can talk about first century authors like Josephus, who's writing about the Jewish role in Jesus' death, or Tacitus, who's writing about the Roman role in Jesus' death. But for some people, they want to go back even further, and we say, well, we don't really have any texts about Jesus during his lifetime, but this is actually one that I think is pretty amazing. For those who don't see the Bible as an authority, it's hard for them to think about it because it's kind of like the creed in 1 Corinthians 15. It predates the New Testament writing, but people have to get to the point where they're like, okay, just because it's in the Bible, it doesn't mean that it was created at the time of writing. It existed beforehand. What's some of the evidence that would help people see that sign that we read about in the Gospels is not just something that was only in the Gospels, but evidence that actually convinces Jewish and atheist scholars that it was in existence?
I mean, one of the facts is that it fits the picture of crucifixion that we get from other writers like Seneca and Suetonius, and there's many writers who speak about what it was like for some, what happened when someone was crucified. And one of the things that they describe is that they would carry around their neck usually a sign that had their crime written on it, and then that crime would then be nailed to the cross in some way. And so it fits with that description. But I think the primary thing that convinces even skeptics on this is just the title itself. The King of the Jews is not a title that's used by anyone else in the New Testament for Jesus, and even among the early church fathers, and go through all of really church history. No one is calling Jesus the King of the Jews. That's not a common title used. They might refer back to this text and then say, yes, he really is the King of the Jews. I mean, that's the irony of the story. But this wasn't a title that was being used. It's similar to, I use the parallel in that Josephus passage about Jesus, the famous one where there are interpolations. But in that passage, Josephus calls Jesus a wise man. And he calls Jesus a worker of paradoxa, of wonderful works. These are words that show up in other places of Josephus, and these are words that are never used of Jesus by the New Testament or the early church fathers. So it's a strong argument that Josephus probably did say this about Jesus. This is probably how Josephus described him, at least in those places. So in the same way, this is probably reflecting history here, that this is how he was presented when he was nailed to the cross. This was his crime. He claimed to be the King of the Jews, but of course Pilate just put the King of the Jews probably to tick the Jewish leaders off. That's why they got mad at him and said, no, don't say that. Say he claimed to be the King of the Jews. This was a big sign to any would-be messiahs: don't mess with Rome, or this could be you. Right. So when we compare the Jesus, that's right. When we compare the Jesus movement to some of these other messianic movements, how much similarity is there? How much dissimilarity is there? How does Jesus stand out amongst these other movements? Yeah, it's really fascinating. And it's sad that so many books on the resurrection, books that are, great books in other ways, but just don't talk about this. I really first discovered this when I was reading through Josephus himself, and also, of course, N.T. Wright does a great job laying out the parallels and differences between Jesus and these other movements. But by my count, there's 14, at least from Josephus, from Philo of Alexandria, and from some other writers. We know of 14 other movements, ranging basically from about 40 BC, so about 40 years before Jesus is the first, right at the time that King Herod begins reigning, and then about 100 years after Jesus' crucifixion, so about 135 AD. So you have a range of about 40 to 135, and then before that, before 40 BC, you don't really have anybody like this, and then after 135, the Jews basically give up on fighting against Rome. They're going to be just people of the Torah at that point. But the similarities is we don't know exactly what some of these, many of them were claiming, but we know that Josephus tells us they claim to be a king, that they would claim to do miraculous acts, that some of them even predicted the destruction of the temple. They clearly had large amounts of followers. They had quite a few disciples, some of them in the thousands, a lot more than Jesus in some cases. But what makes really them different than Jesus in all cases is the fact that they fought against Rome. So that's ultimately what led to their demise, was that they ended up being crucified or beheaded or disappeared in some way. But ultimately it was because they fought against Rome. Jesus, of course, and he commanded his disciples, put your sword back in its sheath. Do not, he who lives by the sword dies by the sword. So Jesus and his disciples did not fight against Rome, but he was, of course, still crucified because they perceived him as a threat, like these other messianic pretenders. But yeah, lots of similarities, and of course, then the ultimate difference would be that all of those other movements ended after their leader, their messianic pretender, or whatever they were claiming, died. Those movements just ended. It was done. But with the Jesus movement, of course, their movement not only continued, but it went on to turn the Roman Empire upside down and became the largest religion in the world to this day. Quite a difference. And I like to compare, Jesus and Simon Bar Kokhba. Simon Bar Kokhba was the last of these messianic pretenders, really the most successful. I mean, he clearly had, if the sources are right, and they're probably exaggerated, but he had maybe hundreds of thousands of followers. He actually ruled over Jerusalem for about 3 years. He even issued coins that said year 1 for the redemption of Israel, year 2 for the redemption of Israel. He didn't get to year 3. So we don't have coins that say year 3. But we have letters from him that he wrote to his generals. But ultimately, Hadrian, the emperor at the time, sent his general to behead him and crush his followers. But I like to compare the two because they both claim to be Messiah. They both claim to be king. Both had disciples. Simon Bar Kokhba had so much more. He actually had a physical kingdom for at least 2.5 years. And yet to this day, Jesus rules over an empire that encompasses a third of the world. And Simon Bar Kokhba, no one really knows about him except people who study these specific aspects of this area, of this history. Many of your people watching this, listening to this, probably didn't hear about Simon Bar Kokhba until I brought him up. So how's that possible? Why isn't there? Where are the followers of Simon Bar Kokhba? Why isn't there a religion called Bar Kokhbianity or Bar Kokhbianism? Where is that religion? How is Christianity, the most dominant faith and religion in the world, based on this crucified man? It's really just extraordinary. It's because Jesus rose from the dead and Simon Bar Kokhba stayed dead.
So why didn't any other messianic movement, especially Simon Bar Kokhba, why didn't they make the claim that their Messiah rose from the dead too?
It's especially with Simon Bar Kokhba, because they knew Christians. In fact, Justin Martyr, the early church father Justin Martyr, was not too far away when he refers back to the recent war. And the recent war for him was the Bar Kokhba revolt. And he talks about how Christians were persecuted and and tortured if they did not curse Christ. And Bar Kokhba and his followers tried to get them to renounce and curse Jesus. And so they knew the claims, they knew about Christianity. So it really is amazing that none of his followers, imitated that. None of his followers said, well, the Christian movement kept going, even though their leader died. So why can't we say Simon rose from the dead? It's clear their mindset was not like the 19th century Americans. Their mindset was, no, Simon is dead. That means it's over. I don't care what people say. He's not going to rise from the dead. So,
wow.
So it really is amazing.
Even with the Christian movement, they didn't have this idea of, oh, let's just say our Messiah, resurrected, because that wasn't in their mindset. Even after Jesus, the movement after him, with that idea already around because of the success of the Christian movement, despite the crucifixion of Jesus, they didn't try to copy that because it would be ludicrous to try something like that. They couldn't copy the Christian message.
Yeah, I don't think his followers would have been interested in him in continuing to follow him after he died. I think they were just angry. Yeah, that's so fascinating. Hey, if you're watching this right now or listening to us, please hit that like button. Now it really helps other people see this video on YouTube, and consider subscribing if you're enjoying this kind of content. Now, we are going through, Justin, the resurrection chapter of your book, The Bedrock of Christianity. And in that chapter, you talk about 3 pure innovations, you call them. And let's talk about each one of those. The first one was originally brought to my attention by N.T. Wright when he said, if you take a look at the cross, people have crosses around their necks and they, use the cross as like a design piece. But back in the first century, as we all know, the cross was not a lovely, precious moments kind of thing. It was not a Pinteresty kind of thing. It was a brutal, gory, death metal kind of gruesome device for torturing people. And yet it's a historical fact that the Christians made the cross their symbol very early on. And you have to ask why that is because for them, it was a symbol of Jesus' love for them. And that was so powerful for me when I heard that. But talk about this being a pure innovation, this positive interpretation of the cross and a crucified Messiah. How do you see that as a pure innovation? Yeah, and on this, another N.T. Wright's great to read, another just great it's a short work, but just packed with so much information, especially in the footnotes, just full of such amazing information on the cross and crucifixion in the ancient world. It's actually called Crucifixion in the Ancient World by the German scholar Martin Hengel, Hengel. Highly recommend that little work. But yeah, and he makes the point in that book that he isn't aware of any positive interpretation of a philosopher, of a Jewish leader, like some of the ones we mentioned. Many people were crucified in the ancient world, and no one ever looked at it as, oh, there's a good thing. There's light at the end of this tunnel. There was never a positive look on that. It was always, this is shameful. This is the worst of deaths. This is the most gruesome of deaths. That person must be cursed by God if they were crucified. And so this is what makes the early Christians so fascinating. And so early, they were probably not even called Christians as early as they were saying this, that the sect of the Nazarenes, or the as the book of Acts calls them, the way. But this early movement following Jesus as the Messiah and risen again from the dead, who had been crucified, they were saying, like Paul says, the cross is the power of God. It's the wisdom of God. I want to know nothing among you but Jesus Christ and him crucified. Where are they getting this idea that crucifixion is a positive thing? Mm-hmm. And like you said, the cross ended up becoming this symbol that represented the power of God. You want to see the power of God, the same power that brought the universe, the cosmos together. Look at the cross. Look at Jesus hanging on the cross. Mm-hmm. That's just, it's a truly novel mutation, as the late Larry Hurtado put it.
The second pure innovation that you mentioned in chapter 5, I believe it is, in your book, is that a crucified Messiah rose from the dead. Now, how is that different from, people will say, well, but like Lazarus was believed to have risen from the dead and Jesus was believed to have raised a little girl, or people in the Old Testament. How is that different than this innovation?
Yeah, the second key innovation that I emphasize, and this kind of follows 1 Corinthians 15, Christ died according to, for our sins, according to the scriptures. He was buried, and then he was raised on the third day, according to the scriptures. So this claim that he was raised, there it's a gyro, but just a little bit later in 1 Corinthians 15, he's using it synonymously with anastasis. And this type of resurrection, this resurrection that the Jews were expecting at the end of the world, the one prophesied by Daniel from Daniel chapter 12 that I quoted earlier, that type of resurrection is what the early Christians were saying began in Jesus. In fact, there's a great text in the book of Acts, chapter 4, in the early part of chapter 4, where they said that it says that they were proclaiming in Jesus the resurrection of the dead. So it's not just that they were saying Jesus rose from the dead. It wasn't just like Lazarus coming back from death and then die again. In Jesus, the resurrection of the future that they're waiting for, that future general resurrection has begun. It's already begun in Jesus, which means, and that's why I love the other language, new creation, the new heavens and the new earth that's going to, transform the entire cosmos. That's already been done in the flesh of Jesus, in the corpse of Jesus. That new creation has already begun. And that's what they were saying. And so again, where did that idea come from? The positive interpretation of the cross and the fact that the Daniel resurrection has begun in this man, Jesus, this crucified man, Jesus. Incredible to me, extraordinary. This is and we know that this is what they were saying from the earliest. I mean, 1 Corinthians 15, as we said, goes back to that first 5 years. I like even Dale Allison in our discussion. He says it goes back to the first week. This all goes back to the first week. These unique innovations go back to the first week.
Wow. That's amazing. Yeah. Well, let's move on to the third pure innovation you mentioned in your book, which is that Jesus was believed to be divine. And I might add something. This is how I started my dissertation, actually, was noting that very early on in a Jewish context, Andrew Chester noted in 2011 that there was a virtual consensus that Jesus was believed to be divine very early on in a Jewish context. So talk a little bit about that. Where did this pure innovation come from that Jesus was believed to be divine?
Yeah. I mean, this has to be even though the other two are incredible, this is the most astonishing one.
Oh, yeah.
Again, no one is expecting the Messiah to be God in some sense, to be divine in some sense. I mean, this is not expected. And I'm amazed because, I really believe when you go back into the Old Testament, you can find passages that does show that this one who will come from David will be divine, will be in some sense God. You have the Son of Man figure. You have many texts that I think, suggest this, but it must have just been so radical. And because the Jews were such strict monotheists, they couldn't, they just dismissed it. They just had to ignore it, I guess, because we don't find, but like we said, we only have a small amount of information. So maybe there were Jews who expected a divine Messiah, and we just don't have the literature. But of what we know, no one was expecting this. And so again, they're not just saying Jesus crucified, died for our sins, that he began the resurrection of Daniel. They're saying Jesus is the God in the flesh. He is the Logos in the flesh. He is Yahweh in the flesh. He is the God who created all things as a human being. And the later creeds would say fully God, fully man. They're not laying it out, all clearly like that. But that I do think that's the right interpretation of what is being said in these earliest texts, like Philippians 2, the hymn in Philippians 2 saying that he is pre-existent. He has always been God. He added to himself a human nature. He became a human, and he was crucified, and then he was raised as the God-man. He was raised to the highest of heights. He was raised back to the right hand of God. And then it quotes Isaiah 45, which originally is applied to Yahweh, that to Yahweh, every knee will bow.
That's
every
amazing.
tongue will confess.
Yeah.
But now it's applied to Jesus. But in case the Sabellianists are hanging around, Paul makes clear to the glory of God the Father. So it's not that Jesus has replaced the God of the Old Testament. It's not that he's replaced the Father. He is still he is Yahweh, and the Father is Yahweh, and the Spirit of Yahweh. But there's only one God. There's only one God. But so this is how later on they would break this up and really clarify how to understand the three persons in the one God. But that's what you're left with these texts like Philippians 2. You're left with the fact that Jesus is now being presented as Yahweh in the flesh, but there's still God the Father. So how do you put this together? And so it took hundreds of years for the Christians to really get the language right in these creeds. But I think again, where did this idea come from that he would be God? And I think this goes. I know to your dissertation. it goes back to the fact that Jesus himself claimed to be God. Because I think that if Jesus rose from the dead, that would be this monumental, obviously extraordinary event, but it wouldn't necessarily make them say Jesus was God.
Right.
I mean, if Elijah rose from the dead, they'd be like, what's going on? But they wouldn't say Elijah's God. They wouldn't say Elijah's Yahweh in the flesh. But Jesus claimed to be the I am. He claimed to be God during his ministry. He claimed to be the Son of Man of Daniel 7, and on and on and on. So I think it confirmed his claims, and they put it all together and said, this is the God from all, this is our creator God. Jesus is on that side of the line. There's the creator and there's creation, and Jesus is on the side of the creator God.
Jesus is so fascinating on so many levels, and the more you study him, you just can't plumb the depths of the profundity of Jesus. I'll tell you one of the key things. One of the key things I took away from my dissertation work is that I did a historical discussion of Jesus' claims to possess divine authority. And it's historically arguable that Jesus claimed to have divine authority on earth to forgive sins, like in Mark 2, and also divine authority in heaven to judge sins, like in his Jewish examination in Mark 14. And the claim to have authority in heaven and on earth is a merism for all of reality. Who claims that? You put all of Jesus' claims together. He is claiming jurisdiction over every part of the creation. It's just amazing. So
it's like the Philippians to him. Every part of creation will ultimately acknowledge that, whether willingly or unwillingly.
Yeah, well, it seems pretty unlikely that his disciples made up the whole resurrection story. We know it didn't just emerge over decades and decades from other Christians. We have Paul writing about the resurrection of Jesus even before any Gospels were written. And so if you were to put yourself in my shoes that one day that you had a relative at a family gathering come to you and just tell you that the resurrection of Jesus was something that disciples probably just made up, or it just emerged after many decades of cultural reflection. What's a short answer you could give to somebody like that to give them something to think about at a family gathering, that kind of situation?
A very simple way I like to say it is, two undeniable facts of history. We've talked about many undeniable facts, but just two would be Jesus was crucified, and this movement right in the place where he was crucified in Jerusalem, within weeks, within months at most, exploded out of this very place. And that movement has gone on to take over the whole world. What got this movement going? If Jesus died and stayed dead, how did this movement begin? How did this movement, this movement that we call Christianity, how did it go on to conquer the barbarians, to conquer the Roman Empire, to become the largest religion in the world? How did this happen? Where did it all come from if Jesus stayed dead? And that would be just something simple I would start talking about. Then you could talk about all the other, evidence like the appearances. James believed Jesus appeared to him. We have the 500, we have the 12. What did they see? That's a simple question I like to ask unbelievers. I say, well, we know they saw something, and we know, at least in the case of Peter, Paul, and James, that they went to their death believing they saw him. So what did they see? I encourage skeptics who are looking at, this information and looking at the historical facts, I would say, seek and you will find, quoting Jesus, seek and you will find, if you follow the evidence where it leads, I believe you will end up like Thomas, falling at the feet of Jesus, the risen Jesus, saying, my Lord and my God. So, So look into it. Look into it with an open heart, look into it with humility, and look at the evidence. Even the far, very skeptical scholars agree on these facts, and just follow this evidence where it leads, even if it leads to wonderful and even scary places, like the fact that Jesus rose from the dead, because of course that will then, change everything about your reality and what's happening. But it's the greatest news of the world. It's forgiveness of sins. It's the fact that he conquered death. He conquered hell. He conquered the devil. He gives us true freedom. He gives us that true life and life to the full. It's everything that we could ever, hope or dream for if Jesus rose from the dead.
Well, thank you so much for listening and joining us for this conversation. If you'd like to continue the conversation along with me, I'd love it if you would at me on Twitter at ApologeticsGuy or connect with me on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube. I'm ApologeticsGuy on all my socials, and I'd love to hear from you. Please do subscribe to the podcast, and if you enjoy this conversation, please do me a favor and leave a review on Apple or Google Podcasts or wherever you're listening to the show. Really helps get the word out, and it's especially important for new podcasts like this one. I'm your apologetics guy, Dr. Mikel Del Rosario, and until next time, keep the faith.